Well, for many gardeners, probably the easiest part of growing potatoes is the actual planting, because back in early spring we're all motivated to get out in the garden. And we planted our potatoes here in our purple vegetable garden back on February the 27th. So generally most people will plant around the middle to end of February, which is kind of early in some parts of the state, through around the middle of March. Now, the problem comes in with especially new gardeners as when do you appropriately harvest the potatoes? Well, you need to think about several things. First thing is, if you know your variety, and they'll usually suggest how many days it takes for maturity. That's the best guideline to go by. But even better would be to look at the foliage, and here we are now in late June. And really that's even late for us to be harvesting some of the potatoes, again I think because of the cool spring. But look at the foliage. Once it starts to deteriorate like this, that's a good sign that the potatoes are ready to harvest. You'll see they're falling over, there's some spots on the foliage. That's really not from disease per se, it's more from the fact that the foliage is just dying down. Now compare that to the one over here. This is a different cultivar. You can tell the foliage is still pretty vim and vigor, and we need to wait a little bit more before we harvest it. Now a couple of other pointers would be to monitor your soil temperature. We put a soil thermometer in here that goes down about 6 inches, and it's about 88 degrees Fahrenheit. Most of the experts tell us that once the soil temperature starts reaching 90 and above, there's a little bit risk of the potatoes getting too hot and with the moisture in the ground possibly rotting on you. And then really the best thing is just to dig in the ground a couple of times throughout and maybe still one or two just to see if you're pleased with the size. Now these are a little bit dirty and we're going to go ahead and start harvesting them, but let me take some over here and talk to you about some of the new varieties that we've tried here in our purple vegetable garden. Now the first one over here on my left is called Early Blue. And Early Blue, obviously by the name, is an early variety. And when you look at it in the garden, it is one of the three that the foliage is starting to deteriorate. Really, it should mature in about 65 days or a little bit more, but we found one that matured even earlier. But Early Blue, as you can tell by all of them, are a smaller type potato, really more of what is referred to as an Irish potato. But when we cut into this one, it has a purplish blue skin, but the flesh is a creamy color. So that's kind of a unique one in itself. But more so with the next several ones, because they are also a purplish color, but when we cut into one of them, you'll see that in this variety, All Blue, it's got a mixture of a purple flesh as well as the skin inside. And then the next one I want to show you is Purple Marker. And the reason this one got the name Purple Marker, in a lot of experimental stations throughout the United States where they test potatoes, they would grow Purple Marker as a marker variety. And what that means is between all of the other white traditional varieties, they would grow the purple one because it was easy to distinguish between the varieties. But this one also has a purple flesh. And really this one is considered a mid-season along with the All Blue, but for us, this is the first time we've tried them. The Purple Marker, the foliage is deteriorating quicker on it than the Early Blue. So again, those numbers are just guidelines. You never know how they'll perform in your particular garden. The last one is the one that the foliage is still up and pretty green. It's called Purple Peruvian. It also has a purple flesh to it, even more so than the others, but it's called a fingerling type potato, and that means that they're usually smaller, longer, more cylindrical in shape, but we have not ever had much luck with the fingerlings here at the Studio Gardens. They take longer to mature, and for some reason the heat and things get to them and they really don't like our heavy soil. So we tried them just as a novelty, again, just to show you the flesh. But it's probably not a good selection for most gardeners to grow in the state of Oklahoma as far as the fingerlings go. So really, all things considered, especially with the fact that the potatoes stood in water for a large part of their growing time, have done pretty good, and we're pretty pleased with them. They're small, but again, a lot of people prefer them that way. Now I want to walk over and show you a relative of the potato, which is the tomato, and they're not faring too good. And let me show you what I'm talking about. Well, we won't be winning any bragging right contest with our tomatoes this year. Not only is the foliage very sparse, but we're starting to have some other problems set in. Now, of course, gardeners always blame it on the weather, and that has a lot to do with it. But our first mistake was that when we put the plants in this year, we didn't side dress or put any fertilizer in. Now remember, in our case with our soil test, we really don't need to put a complete fertilizer on initially because we have our N, P, and K, or at least our P and K. But what we should have done is after we got them planted, come in with some nitrogen and side dress them a couple of times, and that never did occur. It just got too busy for us and then it got too wet. The other problem is that we're having some fruit rot, and if you look at the bottom of the fruit here, you can see what I'm talking about. That is the blossom end, which is the bottom of the tomato fruit, and it's starting to show up on just about every one of them. And that is called blossom end rot. Now, it's not really a disease as far as a pathogen goes, so it's not a fungus or a bacteria. It's called a physiological problem, which means it's a calcium deficiency. Now, you need to think about your practices again. We know that we are really not going to be deficient of calcium either because we've put lime on, and you can also correct it with gypsum, things like that. So that needs to be corrected first. If you've put that on, say in the last couple of 3 years, you should be okay. But what happens is there may be calcium in the soil, but it doesn't move through the plant and get to the fruit, and therefore you get this problem. And the main reason that occurs is because of water movement. Think back, if you will, a few weeks ago again. Remember how much water we had. The tomatoes got used to having a consistent amount of moisture, and tomatoes like a lot of water actually. They'll respond to it as long as they don't set in really heavy wet soils and they drown per se. Well, now it's dried up, the plastic is causing it to get warmer, so the water is deficient, it's not moving it, and that's when the problem occurred. If we would have tried to keep it consistently moist, we probably wouldn't have had this problem as much. So what do we do now? Well, with these fruit, we're going to have to pick them off and throw them in the compost pile because that's it. We can't correct it. But the fruit that's being set up here on the top, the new fruit coming on, we can try to prevent it from occurring there. The way we'll do it is we'll start watering again, keeping it consistently moist. If you water a lot and then you let it dry out again between waterings too much, you're asking for trouble on tomatoes, especially this time of year. Also, we'll try to spray on what is a temporary fix-up, and what we're going to use, this is called No More Rot. You'll find all kinds of brands out there. What it is, it's calcium, either nitrate or calcium chloride. You mix it with water according to directions, and you spray it on the foliage on the plant. It's absorbed in, and hopefully it will move through and stop the other ones from rotting. Now, in our case, we need to add some nitrogen, and you may be wondering how in the world we're going to do that with the plastic mulch. Well, you know, we have a drip irrigation tube that runs right under the plastic. Some systems are fancy enough that you can inject a liquid fertilizer into the system, but we're not going to go to that trouble. We're just going to keep it moist. So what we're going to do is we're just going to take a watering can, mix in a water-soluble fertilizer, and then just water in the little hole that we've created at each spot, and we'll probably do that once a week for the next couple of 3 weeks to try to get a little bit more foliage on. When you look at it, there is not a lot of foliage on these plants, and that's part of the problem. Most of the time people over-fertilize and you get too much growth, and that causes another problem. Also, if you can think about this, a lot of times people will put too much nitrogen on, fertilize too much, and that too can cause the blossom end rot problems. So again, the best thing to remember is keep consistent moisture now during this time of year. Pick off the old ones, dispose of them, and then do a quick fix-up with the calcium chloride or calcium nitrate. But if your soils are truly deficient, you need to correct that before you plant next year. And just kind of watch the insects because, of course, they'll be coming on pretty soon as well.